The train's whistle pierced the Arizona desert air like a wounded animal's cry, announcing Clara Whitman's arrival to a world that would shatter every dream she'd carried across 3 states. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dust swirled through the open windows of the passenger car as the locomotive ground to a halt at Copper Ridge Station, a weathered wooden platform that looked more like an abandoned shed than a gateway to her new life. Clara smoothed her best traveling dress, a deep blue wool that had seemed so elegant back in Philadelphia, but now felt heavy and impractical under the scorching territorial sun. She clutched the worn envelope containing Thomas Brennan's letters, each one promising a life of prosperity on a thriving ranch, a loving husband eager to build a family, and escape from the suffocating expectations of Eastern society. The photograph, tucked inside, showed a handsome man with kind eyes standing proudly beside a substantial ranch house, mountains rising majestically in the background. For 6 months, those letters had been her lifeline, pulling her through the grief of losing her parents and the shame of her family's financial ruin. But as Clara stepped onto the platform, scanning the sparse crowd for Thomas's familiar face, a cold dread began to settle in her chest. The station master, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, barely glanced up from his ledger when she approached. The handful of other passengers dispersed quickly, claimed by waiting families or disappearing into the dusty streets of Copper Ridge. Clara stood alone, her single trunk at her feet, watching the sun sink lower toward the red mesa that dominated the horizon. "Excuse me," she called to the station master, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for Thomas Brennan. He was supposed to meet me here." The man's weathered face went pale, and he set down his pencil with shaking fingers. "Ma'am, you best talk to Sheriff Hartwell about that. You'll find him down at the jailhouse, 2 blocks that way." He pointed toward the main street but wouldn't meet her eyes, and Clara felt her world begin to tilt on its axis. The walk to the sheriff's office felt like marching toward her own execution. Copper Ridge's main street stretched before her like a dusty wound cut into the desert, lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The Silver Dollar Saloon's batwing doors swung lazily in the evening breeze, releasing bursts of raucous laughter and piano music that felt obscene against the growing knot of fear in Clara's stomach. A few townspeople paused to stare at the well-dressed stranger, their faces a mixture of curiosity and something that looked disturbingly like pity. Sheriff Ben Hartwell's office occupied a squat adobe building at the end of the street, its walls thick enough to muffle the sounds of whatever trouble the frontier regularly served up. Clara's hand trembled as she knocked on the heavy wooden door, and when it swung open to reveal a tall man with silver-streaked hair and grave brown eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that her carefully constructed future had just crumbled to dust. "You must be Miss Whitman," Sheriff Hartwell said, gently removing his hat. "I've been expecting you. Please come in and sit down." The office was sparse but clean, furnished with a battered desk, 2 wooden chairs, and a gun rack that held more rifles than Clara had ever seen in one place. Wanted posters covered one wall, their crude sketches staring down at her like a gallery of demons. Sheriff Hartwell poured her a cup of coffee from a pot that had clearly seen better days, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were handling something fragile that might break at any moment. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Thomas Brennan," he began, settling into the chair across from her. 3 weeks ago, Tom was murdered, shot down in cold blood by a gang of outlaws led by a man called Jake Donovan. They call him Scar on account of the mark that runs from his left ear to his chin, courtesy of an Apache war party he tangled with years back. The coffee cup slipped from Clara's nerveless fingers, shattering against the wooden floor and sending dark liquid spreading across the planks like spilled blood. The sheriff made no move to clean it up, just watched her face with the patient expression of a man who had delivered too much bad news in his lifetime. "Tom was a good man," Sheriff Hartwell continued, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "He talked about you constantly, showed everyone in town your photograph, said you were going to civilize this wild country, bring some Eastern refinement to his ranch. He was so excited about your arrival that he rode into Silver Creek early that morning to buy you a proper wedding ring. That's where they caught him, right outside Jameson's jewelry shop. Shot him down like a dog in the street and rode off with everything he had, including the ring he'd just purchased." Clara felt as though she were drowning, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Everything she had sacrificed, every bridge she had burned to get here, had been for nothing. Thomas was dead, murdered by men whose names she had never heard, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. She was alone in a hostile land, with barely enough money to survive a week, let alone book passage back to a Philadelphia that no longer held any place for her. "Why?" she whispered, the words scraping against her throat like broken glass. "Why? Would they kill him?" "The Donovan gang has been terrorizing this territory for months," Sheriff Hartwell explained, leaning forward in his chair. "They rob stages, hit isolated ranches, murder anyone who gets in their way. Tom must have seen something he shouldn't have, or maybe they just wanted his horse and didn't feel like leaving witnesses. Men like Scar Donovan don't need much reason to kill." Through the office window, Clara could see the last rays of sunlight, painting the mountains gold and crimson, the same mountains that had looked so majestic in Thomas's photograph. Now they seemed like prison walls, trapping her in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. She thought of the letters she had written to her few remaining friends back east, telling them about her grand adventure, her escape from the confines of polite society. The humiliation of returning home penniless and broken would be almost as unbearable as staying in this godforsaken place. "There's more, ma'am," Sheriff Hartwell said softly. "Tom left instructions with the bank that if anything happened to him, his ranch was to be held in trust until you arrived. He wanted to make sure you had a place to go, no matter what. It's not much, just a small spread about 5 miles outside. And town. But the house is solid and there's good water. The cattle are gone, of course. Donovan's boys drove them off the same day they killed Tom." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "He left me his ranch? But we weren't even married. I'm a stranger to everyone here." "Tom was an optimistic man," the sheriff replied with a sad smile. "He believed in taking care of people, especially those who couldn't take care of themselves. He also believed in justice, which brings me to the other matter I need to discuss with you. I've been hunting the Donovan gang for 6 months, and I finally have a lead on their hideout. I'm putting together a posse to go after them, and I want you to know that when we catch them, they'll pay for what they did to Tom." The office door opened with a sharp bang, and Clara looked up to see a man silhouetted against the dying light. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothes marked him as a working man rather than a gentleman, his leather vest scarred and his boots worn from long hours in the saddle. But there was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that spoke of competence and unshakable purpose that made Clara sit up straighter in her chair. "Sheriff, I just heard about the lady's arrival," the newcomer said, removing his hat to reveal a face that was more interesting than handsome, marked by sun and wind, and the kind of character that came from facing hard choices. "Nathan Cross," he said, extending his hand to Clara. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom. Tom was a good friend of mine." Nathan Cross's handshake was firm but gentle, his calloused palm warm against Clara's cold fingers. Unlike Sheriff Hartwell's formal sympathy, there was something raw and personal in Nathan's condolences, as if Thomas's death had carved a wound in him that was still bleeding. Clara found herself studying his face, noting the fine lines around. His eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the desert sun, the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned Thomas's name. "Nathan here is my deputy and the best tracker in the territory," Sheriff Hartwell explained. "He's the one who found the trail that led us to Donovan's hideout in Devil's Canyon. If anyone can bring those murderers to justice, it's him." "I made Tom a promise," Nathan said, his voice low and steady. "I told him that if anything ever happened to him, I'd make sure his affairs were settled proper. That includes making sure you're taken care of, Miss Whitman. Tom would haunt me from beyond the grave if I let his intended bride come to harm." And Clara felt a flush of anger rise in her chest, hot and unexpected. "I don't need taking care of," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I came out here to build a life, not to be anyone's burden or charity case. If Thomas left me that ranch, then I'll find a way to make it work." Beam. Nathan's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time since she had entered the sheriff's office, Clara saw something that might have been approval flicker across his features. "That's good to hear, Ma'am. The frontier has a way of sorting out those who can stand on their own from those who can't, but standing on your own doesn't mean you have to stand alone." Sheriff Hartwell stood up and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening street. "The town's only hotel is the Copper Ridge Inn, 3 doors down from the Silver Dollar. Mrs. Foster runs it, and she's decent folk. You can stay there tonight, and tomorrow Nathan will take you out to see Tom's place. After that, it's your decision. What you want to do? What about the men who killed him?" Clara asked, surprised by the steel she heard in her own voice. "When will you go after them?" "Day after tomorrow," Nathan answered. "Soon as we get a few more volunteers for the posse. Donovan's got at least 6 men with him, all of them killers. It's not the kind of fight you want to go into short-handed." Clara stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The shattered coffee cup crunched under her feet as she moved toward the door, each step carrying her further from the life she had planned and deeper into an uncertain future. But as she paused in the doorway, something hard and bright began to form in her chest, a determination that surprised her with its intensity. "When you catch them," she said, not looking back, "I want to be there. I want to see their faces when they pay for what they did." Sheriff Hartwell started to protest, but Nathan held up a hand to stop him. "We'll see, ma'am," he said quietly. "We'll see." The Copper Ridge Inn turned out to be a 2-story wooden building with a front porch that sagged under the weight of too many Arizona summers. Mrs. Adelaide Foster, a round woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, met Clara at the door with a sympathy that felt genuine rather than merely polite. She had prepared the best room in the house, she explained, the one with the window that faced the mountains rather than the main street, and she wouldn't hear of accepting payment for the first night. "Tom Brennan was a good man," Mrs. Foster said as she led Clara up the narrow staircase. "He helped my husband fix our roof last spring when the winter storms damaged it, wouldn't take a penny for his trouble. The least I can do is make sure his intended is comfortable." The room was small but clean, furnished with an iron bed, a washstand, and a chair that had seen better days. Through the window, Clara could see the lights of Copper Ridge twinkling, like fallen stars against the vast darkness of the desert. Somewhere out there in that wilderness, the men who had murdered Thomas were probably sitting around a campfire, laughing and drinking and planning their next attack, completely unaware that their victims had names and faces and people who mourned their passing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Clara unpacked her few belongings with mechanical precision, hanging her dresses in the narrow wardrobe and arranging her toiletries on the washstand. The face that stared back at her from the small mirror looked like a stranger's, pale and hollow-eyed, marked by exhaustion and grief. She had left Philadelphia as a hopeful bride, embarking on a great adventure. She'd arrived in Copper Ridge as something else entirely, though she wasn't yet sure what that something was. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed listening to the sounds of the frontier town settling into uneasy sleep, Clara thought about the photograph of Thomas that she had carried so carefully across 3 states. In her mind, she tried to picture him lying dead in the street outside a jewelry shop, his blood soaking into the dust while his killers rode away with the ring he had bought for her. The image should have brought tears, but instead it brought something colder and harder, a resolve that crystallized like ice forming on a winter pond. She had come west to marry Thomas Brennan and build a life with him. That dream was dead, shot down in a street she had never seen by men whose faces she had never glimpsed. But she was not dead, and neither was her determination to carve out a place for herself in this harsh land. If the ranch Thomas had left her was the foundation, she needed to build that life. Then she would make it work, no matter what obstacles stood in her way. And if Nathan Cross and his posse could bring Thomas's killers to justice, then perhaps some small measure of peace could be found in this desert wasteland that had already taken so much from her. Clara closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her dreams were full of gunfire and the sound of horses' hooves disappearing into the night, carrying death and destruction toward an uncertain horizon. Dawn came slowly to Copper Ridge, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose that Clara might have found beautiful under different circumstances. She had slept poorly, her dreams haunted by phantom gunshots and the face of a man she would never meet. Mrs. Foster knocked gently on her door as the sun crested the mountains, bringing coffee and warm biscuits that Clara forced herself to eat despite her lack of appetite. "Deputy Cross is waiting downstairs whenever you're ready," Mrs. Foster said softly. "He's got a wagon hitched and ready to take you out to the Brennan place. It's about an hour's ride," he says. Clara dressed carefully in her most practical traveling outfit, a brown wool skirt and matching jacket that would hide the dust of the desert road. She pinned her dark hair back severely and checked her reflection one final time in the small mirror. The woman who stared back at her looked determined rather than devastated, and she decided that would have to be enough. Nathan Cross stood beside a sturdy wagon in front of the inn, checking the harness with the methodical attention of a man who understood that small details could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. He had traded his deputy's vest for a plain work shirt and leather jacket, but the gun belt around his waist and the rifle secured behind the wagon seat marked him clearly as a man accustomed to trouble. "Good morning, Miss Whitman," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I hope you managed to get some rest." "Enough," Clara replied, accepting his hand as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. His touch was steady and impersonal, but she noticed the calluses that spoke of hard work and the careful way he positioned himself between her and the street, as if even in broad daylight he expected danger to materialize from the shadows. The road to Thomas's ranch wound through a landscape that seemed designed to humble human ambitions. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient monuments to some forgotten civilization, and sparse vegetation clung to life in the sandy soil with grim determination. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the soft dirt, and Clara found herself gripping the seat as they navigated washouts and boulder fields that would have challenged a mountain goat. "Tom picked this land because of the water," Nathan explained. As they crested a low ridge, Copper Creek runs year-round through the property, fed by springs up in the mountains. In this country, water is more valuable than gold or silver. Below them, Clara could see a small valley sheltered by red rock walls, with a ribbon of green marking the creek's path through the center. A modest house sat on a rise overlooking the water, its adobe walls and tin roof practical rather than elegant. A barn and several outbuildings completed the homestead, all of them bearing the weathered look of structures built to withstand the harsh realities of frontier life. "It's smaller than I expected," Clara said, surprised by how much. The admission stung. Thomas's letters had described a thriving ranch with hundreds of cattle and vast pastures stretching to the horizon. The reality was more modest, though she could see the potential in the protected valley and reliable water source. Tom was an optimistic man, Nathan said diplomatically. He had big dreams for this place, but he was still building toward them when he let the sentence trail off, but Clara understood. Thomas had been murdered before his dreams could become reality, leaving behind only the foundation of what might have been. The house proved to be larger inside than it appeared. From the road, with 3 rooms and a stone fireplace that dominated one wall, Thomas had clearly been preparing for Clara's arrival. Curtains hung at the windows, and the main room held furniture that was simple but well made. A bed frame in the smaller room had been assembled but never used, and Clara felt her throat tighten as she imagined Thomas carefully putting it together in anticipation of their wedding night. He worked on this place every evening after finishing his other chores, Nathan said, running his hand along the smooth surface of a wooden table. Wanted everything to be perfect for when you arrived. He even planted a vegetable garden behind the house, though I'm afraid it's gone to weeds now. Clara walked through the room slowly, touching the furniture and opening the few drawers, trying to build a picture of the man she had traveled so far to marry. His clothes still hung on pegs in the main room, work shirts and denim trousers that spoke of long days under the desert sun. A small collection of books sat on a shelf beside the fireplace, their titles revealing a man who read everything from agricultural manuals to Shakespeare. "What was he like?" she asked suddenly, turning to face Nathan. Not the man in his letters, but the real Thomas Brennan. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, his storm-grey eyes focused on something beyond the window. Tom was the kind of man who would give you his last dollar if you needed it more than he did, he finally said. He saw the best in everyone, sometimes when it wasn't there to see. He believed this country could be civilized without losing its wildness, and he figured love was what would make the difference. No, did he love me? The question slipped out before Clara could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. I mean, we never met. How could he love someone he'd never seen? Tom fell in love with your letters, Nathan said simply. He used to read them aloud in the Silver Dollar until Frank Russo threatened to bar him from the place. He said, you wrote like someone who understood loneliness, but wasn't defeated by it. He said, you had courage. Clara felt tears threaten for the first time since learning of Thomas's death, but she blinked them away with fierce determination. Crying wouldn't bring him back or make her situation any less precarious. She had a ranch now, and water, and a roof over her head. It was more than many people had in this harsh territory, and she would find a way to make it enough. The cattle are gone, Nathan continued, his voice carefully neutral. Donovan's gang drove them off the same day they killed Tom, but there are still some chickens in the coop, and the vegetable garden could be salvaged with some work. The well is good, and the barn is sound. It's not much, but it's a start. Clara nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. How many cattle were there? About 40 head, mostly young stock that Tom was building his herd. Around, they represented most of his savings, everything he'd worked for since coming to Arizona. Without them, Nathan shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its implications. Without them, there's no income from the ranch, Clara finished. No way to support myself or rebuild the herd. The bank in Copper Ridge might be willing to extend credit based on the land and water rights, Nathan suggested, but his tone indicated he didn't hold much hope for that possibility. Or you could sell the place and use the money to go back east. The suggestion hung in the air between them, like a challenge. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the valley that Thomas had chosen as the foundation for their life together. The creek sparkled in the morning sunlight, and she could see where he had begun to clear additional pasture from the scrubland. It was hard country, unforgiving and dangerous, but there was something about its stark beauty that called to something deep in her soul. "I'm not going back east," she said firmly. "This is my home now, whatever that means. Thomas left it to me, and I'm going to find a way to make it work." Nathan studied her for a moment, and Clara had the feeling she was being measured against some internal standard. "That's not going to be easy," he said finally. "A woman alone out here with no cattle and no income. There are dangers you haven't even considered yet. Such as Apaches, for one thing. They've been quiet lately, but that could change without warning. Rustlers and claim jumpers who might decide an unprotected woman is an easy target. The desert itself, which can kill you in a dozen different ways if you're not careful. And men, like the Donovan gang, who see isolated homesteads as opportunities rather than homes." Clara turned from the window to face him directly. "Are you trying to frighten me into leaving?" "I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're facing," Nathan replied. "If you're determined to stay, then you need to know what you're up against. And you need to know that help is available if you're willing to accept it." "What kind of help?" Nathan seemed to choose his words carefully. "I know this country, and I know the people in it. I can teach you what you need to know to survive. Here, how to read the weather, how to spot trouble before it finds you, how to defend yourself if it comes to that. In return, maybe you could help me with something." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean? The Donovan gang has been hitting isolated ranches and homesteads for months. They know this territory better than we do, and they're always one step ahead of any pursuit. But Tom's murder was different, personal. They took their time with it, made sure he suffered before they killed him. That tells me they had a reason beyond simple robbery." "What kind of reason?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, his jaw working as if he were chewing over words he wasn't sure he should speak. Tom saw something or knew something that made him dangerous to them. Before he died, he sent a letter to Sheriff Hartwell saying he had information about the gang's hideout and their next target. The letter arrived the day after his murder. Clara felt her blood turn to ice. "You think they killed him to keep him quiet?" "I think Tom stumbled onto something that could have destroyed them, and they silenced him before he could share it with the law. But here's the thing, Miss Whitman. If Tom hid evidence somewhere, it would most likely be here, on his own property, and if we could find it, you could track them down and make them pay." Clara finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Justice would be served," Nathan corrected, but Clara caught the steel beneath his diplomatic words. "The question is whether you're willing to help me search this place from top to bottom. It could be dangerous. If the gang suspects we're getting close to their secrets, they might come here looking for whatever Tom hid." Clara looked around the modest house that Thomas had prepared for their life together, imagining him moving through these rooms in his final days, knowing he was in danger, but determined to see justice done. The man who had written her such hopeful letters about their future had died trying to protect other innocent people from the same fate that had befallen him. "When do we start?" she asked. Nathan's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been approval or respect. "Right now, if you're ready. We'll begin with the house and work our way through the outbuildings. If Tom hid something, here, we're going to find it." They spent the rest of the morning conducting a methodical search of the house, examining every piece of furniture for hidden compartments, checking the walls for loose boards, even pulling up floorboards in search. of concealed hiding places. Nathan worked with the systematic patience of a man accustomed to tracking prey across vast distances, while Clara contributed a woman's intuition about the kinds of places a careful man might choose to hide something precious. The search revealed little beyond the ordinary possessions of a bachelor rancher. Thomas's personal effects were modest but well maintained, suggesting a man who took care of what he owned because he couldn't afford to replace it carelessly. His clothes bore the repairs of a man who lived alone, and his few books showed the wear of being read and reread during long winter evenings. He was lonely, Clara observed, holding a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that fell open automatically to a poem about lost love. Really lonely. "Most of us are out here," Nathan replied, examining the interior of an old trunk for false bottoms. "It's the price of choosing this kind of life. Freedom and independence cost more than most people realize." In the barn, they found evidence of Thomas's plans for expanding his operation. Unused lumber stacked against one wall suggested he had been preparing to build additional corrals, and a collection of branding irons indicated his intention to mark cattle with his own distinctive brand. The hayloft held several months' worth of feed, now useless without livestock to consume it. He was planning to buy more cattle this spring, Nathan said, examining a notebook filled with Thomas's careful calculations. He'd been corresponding with ranchers in Texas about purchasing breeding stock. He was going to build this place into something substantial. Clara climbed the ladder to the hayloft, thinking about the places where a cautious man might hide something he didn't want. Found. The loft was dusty and filled with the sweet smell of dried grass, but as she moved toward the far corner, her foot caught on something that didn't belong. "Nathan!" she called, her voice tight with excitement. "I think I found something." He climbed up beside her as she knelt beside a loose floorboard that had been carefully replaced but not nailed down. When she lifted it, they found a small space beneath that contained a leather pouch wrapped in oiled cloth. Nathan opened it carefully, revealing a folded paper covered with Thomas's neat handwriting and a hand-drawn map of the surrounding territory. "Devil's Canyon," Nathan read aloud, studying the map. "Tom marked their hideout, and he's noted the times they come and go. Look at this. He's been watching them for weeks." The paper contained detailed observations about the Donovan gang's movements and habits. Thomas had recorded the number of men in the group, their preferred routes through the desert, and the approximate schedule of their raids. At the bottom of the page, in darker ink as if added later, was a single line that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "Planning to hit the silver shipment from Prescott on the 15th, she read. "That's tomorrow." Nathan's face went grim. The monthly silver shipment from the Prescott mines travels through Copper Ridge on its way to the railroad at Flagstaff. If Donovan's gang hits that stage, they'll kill everyone aboard and steal enough silver to finance their operations for months. Clara felt her heart racing as the implications became clear. "We have to warn them. We have to stop it. We have to get this information to Sheriff Hartwell immediately," Nathan agreed, carefully folding the papers and tucking them inside his jacket. "This is exactly what Tom died trying to protect. With this intelligence, we can set a trap for the gang instead of riding blind into Devil's Canyon." As they climbed down from the loft, Clara felt a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. They had found Thomas's hidden evidence, but its discovery only emphasized how alone he had been in his final days, watching dangerous men and knowing that his own life hung in the balance. He had died trying to protect people he had never met, and now his sacrifice might finally bear fruit. "There's something else," Nathan said as they prepared to leave the barn. "If we're going to set this trap properly, we'll need every advantage we can get. The gang will be expecting an easy target, not a well-armed posse waiting in ambush, but that means you'll be riding into danger. Clara finished. All of you. Nathan nodded soberly. It's what we signed up for when we pinned on these badges, but I want you to understand something, Miss Whitman. After tomorrow, if we're successful, this territory will be a little bit safer. Tom's death won't have been meaningless. Clara looked around the barn one final time, imagining Thomas working here in the evenings, planning his future while secretly documenting the movements of his killers. "Will you take me with you?" she asked suddenly. Nathan's expression hardened. "Absolutely not. This is going to be a gunfight, not a social gathering. I can shoot," Clara said, lifting her chin defiantly. "My father taught me to hunt back in Pennsylvania. I'm not helpless. Shooting deer is different from shooting men who are shooting back at you," Nathan replied firmly. "You'll stay in town where it's safe." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the futility of it in his expression. Nathan Cross was not a man who would be swayed by pleading or cajolery, and she suspected that any attempt to change his mind would only strengthen his resolve to keep her away from the coming confrontation. Instead, she nodded reluctantly and followed him back to the wagon. As they drove away from the ranch, Clara found herself looking back at the modest house and imagining the life she might have built there with Thomas. It would have been a quiet life, probably, marked by hard work and simple pleasures. They might have raised children in that house, expanded the ranch, grown old together, watching the seasons change over the Red Rock Valley. But that future was gone, shot down in a dusty street by men who valued silver more than human life. What remained was a chance for justice and the hope that Thomas's sacrifice might prevent other innocent people from suffering the same fate. It would have to be enough, because it was all they had left to offer the man who had died trying to protect them all. The ride back to Copper Ridge passed in tense silence, both Clara and Nathan lost in their own thoughts about the coming confrontation. The sun had reached its zenith, beating down mercilessly on the desert floor and turning the wagon seat into a furnace. Dust devils danced across the landscape like restless spirits, and the mountains shimmered in the heat haze like a mirage that might dissolve at any moment. When they reached the sheriff's office, they found Ben Hartwell cleaning his rifle with the methodical attention of a man preparing for war. The weapon gleamed with oil and careful maintenance, and several boxes of ammunition sat on his desk, alongside a collection of maps marked with pencil notations. He looked up as Nathan and Clara entered, his weathered face grim with determination. "I was wondering when you'd get back," Sheriff Hartwell said, setting aside his cleaning cloth. "I've been thinking about that silver shipment all morning. If Donovan's planning to hit it, we need to be ready." Nathan pulled Thomas's papers from his jacket and spread them on the desk. "Tom was even more thorough than we hoped. He's got their entire routine mapped out, including the exact spot where they plan to ambush the stage." Sheriff Hartwell studied the map intently, tracing the route with his finger. "Willow Springs Pass," he murmured. "Should have known they'd pick that spot. The road narrows between two rock walls, perfect for an ambush. The stage has to slow down to navigate the turn, and there's no way to retreat once you're committed to the passage." "How many men can you raise for the posse?" Nathan asked, checking his own weapons with practiced efficiency. "I've got commitments. From 6 men so far, counting myself and you. Frank Russo from the saloon, Doc Mills, Pete Henderson from the livery stable, and both the Morrison brothers. All good men who can handle themselves in a fight." Clara felt her pulse quicken as she listened to them plan the ambush. These men were preparing to risk their lives based on information that Thomas had died protecting, and she felt a fierce pride in her murdered fiancé's courage. But beneath the pride lurked a cold fear that more good men might die before justice was served. 8 against 6 aren't bad odds, Nathan observed, especially if we can position ourselves properly. Before they arrive, Tom's notes say they usually hit targets right around noon, when the heat makes everyone sluggish and careless. The stage is due to reach Willow Springs Pass around 11:30, Sheriff Hartwell added. If we leave before dawn, we can be in position well before either the stage or the gang arrives. We'll have the advantage of surprise and higher ground. Clara cleared her throat, drawing both men's attention. What about the people on the stage? If there's a gunfight, they could be caught in the crossfire. Sheriff Hartwell's expression softened slightly. The stage driver is Mike Colton, been running that route for 3 years. He's a good man who knows how to handle himself in trouble. Soon as he sees us, he'll get his passengers down and out of the line of fire. We'll do everything we can to keep innocent folks safe. And if something goes wrong, Clara pressed, if the gang escapes or if someone gets hurt. Nathan met her eyes directly. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But doing nothing isn't an option, Miss Whitman. These men killed Tom and God knows how many others. If we don't stop them tomorrow, they'll just keep killing until someone else does. The logic was unassailable, but Clara still felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had lost one man to the Donovan gang's violence, and the thought of losing another was almost unbearable. Nathan Cross had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had experienced in months back east, and the idea of him riding into danger made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to examine. "I want to help," she said again, knowing even as she spoke that the request would be denied. "You can help by staying safe," Sheriff Hartwell replied firmly. "If something happens to us out there, this town is going to need people like you to carry on. Besides, someone needs to be here to tend the wounded if we bring any back." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the futility of it. These men had made their decision, and nothing she could say would change their minds. Instead, she nodded, reluctantly, and tried to project a confidence she didn't feel. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. "If everything goes according to plan, we should be back by late afternoon," Nathan said. "If not." He shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its implications. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations and farewells. Clara watched from Mrs. Foster's front porch as the men of Copper Ridge made their final arrangements, checking weapons and supplies with the careful attention of soldiers preparing for battle. Wives and sweethearts gathered to offer worried kisses and whispered prayers, while children watched with wide eyes that didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. Frank Russo emerged from the Silver Dollar with a rifle that looked older than statehood itself, but his hands were steady as he checked the action. Doc Mills carried a medical bag alongside his weapon, prepared to heal as well as fight. The Morrison brothers, young men barely out of their teens, tried to project confidence while their mother wept openly in the doorway of the general store. Nathan appeared at Clara's side as the sun began to set, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He had changed into darker clothes that would blend with the desert landscape, and his weapons were arranged with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said quietly, "and to thank you for helping us find Tom's evidence. Without that information, we'd be riding blind into an ambush." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Be careful out there, please." "I intend to," Nathan replied. "But if something does happen, I want you to know that the ranch is yours, free and clear. Tom made sure of that with the bank. Whatever you decide to do with it, you'll have choices." "I've already decided," Clara said firmly. "I'm staying. This is my home now, and I'm going to make it work." Nathan smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I thought you might say that. You've got the kind of backbone this country requires. Tom would have been proud." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small revolver, its nickel plating gleaming in the lamplight. This was Tom's personal weapon. I think he'd want you to have it just in case. Clara accepted the gun with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of it felt foreign in her palm, but also oddly comforting. I told you I can shoot. I remember, but knowing how and being willing to are two different things. I hope you never have to find out the difference. Nathan touched the brim of his hat and walked away, leaving Clara alone on the porch with Thomas's gun and her own churning thoughts. She sat there long after the sun disappeared behind the mountains, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. Dawn came grey and cold to Copper Ridge, with a chill wind that promised heat later, but offered no comfort in the early hours. Clara rose before the sun and dressed in her most practical clothing, then made her way to the sheriff's office to see the posse off. The men gathered in the pre-dawn darkness looked grim and determined, their faces pale in the lamplight, but their resolve unwavering. Sheriff Hartwell checked his pocket watch as the horses stamped and snorted in the morning air. "Time to ride," he announced. "Remember, we get there early and we wait. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We end this clean and quick." The men mounted their horses with the efficient movements of people accustomed to early starts and long rides. Nathan caught Clara's eye from the saddle and touched his hat brim in a final salute, then spurred his horse toward the desert road that led to Willow Springs Pass. Clara watched until the last rider disappeared into the grey dawn, then returned to the inn where Mrs. Foster had coffee and breakfast waiting. The older woman's eyes were red with worry for her husband, who had volunteered to watch the jail while the sheriff was away, and for the young men riding toward what might be their deaths. "It's the waiting that's hardest," Mrs. Foster said, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly. Not knowing whether they're safe or in danger, whether the plan is working or falling apart. Clara nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. The hours stretched ahead like an eternity, each minute marked by the tick of the mantel clock and the sound of her own heartbeat. She tried to read, tried to sew, tried to help Mrs. Foster with the inn's daily routine, but nothing could distract her from the knowledge that somewhere in the desert, good men were preparing to face evil ones in a battle that would determine the fate of the entire territory. Around mid-morning, a commotion in the street drew Clara to the window. A lone rider was approaching Copper Ridge at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat and his clothes dusty from hard travel. She recognized him as one of the stage line's relay riders, the men who changed horses at remote stations to keep the mail and passenger service running. The rider pulled up in front of the sheriff's office and dismounted quickly, looking around for someone in authority. When he saw only Clara and Mrs. Foster watching from the inn's porch, he hurried over with obvious relief. "Ladies, I need to find Sheriff Hartwell right away," he said, removing his hat. "I've got urgent news about the silver shipment." Clara felt her heart sink. "The sheriff's not here. He's out with a posse. What's wrong?" The rider's face went pale. "The shipment's been moved up. They left Prescott at midnight instead of dawn, trying to avoid the heat. That means they'll reach Willow Springs Pass around 10 o'clock instead of 11:30. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the implications. Nathan and the posse were planning to be in position well before 11:30, but if the stage arrived an hour early, it might ride straight into the Donovan gang's ambush before help could arrive. "How long ago did they leave?" she asked, her mind racing through the possibilities. The sheriff's posse, about 4 hours ago. They should be getting close to the pass about now, but if they're not in position yet... Clara didn't wait to hear the rest. She ran back into the inn, ignoring Mrs. Foster's startled questions, and grabbed Thomas's revolver from her room. Her horse-riding experience was limited to sedate trail rides back in Pennsylvania, but desperation gave her courage as she hurried to the livery stable. Pete Henderson's assistant, a young man named Jimmy, was mucking out stalls when she burst through the doors. "I need a horse," she said breathlessly. "Right now. It's an emergency." Jimmy looked uncertain. "Ma'am, Mr. Henderson's gone with the posse." "I don't know if I should. People are going to die if I don't get to Willow Springs Pass immediately," Clara interrupted. "I'll take full responsibility." The urgency in her voice convinced him. Jimmy saddled the fastest horse in the stable, a bay mare with intelligent eyes and a reputation for sure-footedness on difficult terrain. Clara mounted awkwardly, her skirts bunching around her legs in a most improper fashion, but propriety was the least of her concerns. The ride to Willow Springs Pass was a nightmare of heat, dust, and bouncing saddle leather. Clara's inexperience showed in every jarring step, but the mare seemed to sense the urgency and responded with willing speed. The desert landscape flashed, passed in a blur of red rock and sparse vegetation as she pushed the horse to its limits. She could hear gunfire before she could see the pass itself, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Her heart pounded as she realized she was too late to prevent the confrontation, but perhaps not too late to help tip the balance in favor of justice. The scene that greeted her at Willow Springs Pass was chaos incarnate. The silver stage had indeed arrived early and run straight into the Donovan gang's ambush. The vehicle sat tilted at an angle where one wheel had struck a rock, its team of horses pawing nervously at the ground. The driver and guard had taken cover behind the overturned stage, returning fire at muzzle flashes among the rocks above. But Nathan's posse had arrived just in time to turn the ambush around. From positions on the opposite side of the pass, they were pouring disciplined fire into the gang's hideout, forcing the outlaws to fight on two fronts instead of picking off helpless victims. Clara could see Nathan's distinctive hat among the rocks, his rifle flashing as he worked the lever and fired with mechanical precision. Sheriff Hartwell was directing the other men's fire, keeping them coordinated and preventing them from shooting each other in the confusion. But the gang was putting up fierce resistance. Clara could see at least 4 muzzle flashes from their position, and one of the posse members was down, clutching his shoulder while Doc Mills worked frantically to stop the bleeding. The battle could go either way, depending on who ran out of ammunition first or made a fatal mistake. Clara dismounted and tied her horse to a stunted juniper, then began working her way carefully toward Nathan's position. The rocks provided good cover, but she had to move slowly to avoid being shot by either side. Thomas's revolver felt heavy in her hand, its weight both comforting and terrifying. She was halfway to Nathan's position when she saw movement among the rocks to her left. One of the gang members had worked his way around the flank, trying to get behind the posse's line. He was a tall man with a distinctive scar running down the left side of his face, and Clara knew she was looking at Jake "Scar" Donovan himself. Donovan was moving carefully from rock to rock, a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. In another few seconds, he would have a clear shot at Nathan's back, and the deputy would never see death coming. Clara raised Thomas's revolver with hands that surprised her by their steadiness. She had never shot at a human being before, but she thought of Thomas dying in a dusty street and found the resolve she needed. The gun bucked in her hand as she pulled the trigger, the shot echoing off the canyon walls. Her bullet struck Donovan in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering among the rocks. He staggered but didn't fall, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. Clara fired again, this time aiming for his center mass as her father had taught her. The second shot took Donovan in the chest, driving him backward against a boulder. He slid down the rock face slowly, leaving a trail of blood on the stone, his eyes wide with surprise and pain. For a moment, their gazes met across the desert. Air, predator, and prey reversed in an instant of terrible clarity. Nathan heard the shots and turned to see Clara standing among the rocks with smoke rising from Thomas's revolver. His expression went through surprise, anger, and finally, something that might have been admiration. The death of their leader had broken the gang's morale, and the remaining outlaws began calling for quarter. The gunfight ended as suddenly as it had begun, the desert silence returning like a blessing after the thunder of weapons. 3 of the gang members threw down their weapons and emerged from the rocks with their hands raised, while a 4th lay motionless among the boulders where Sheriff Hartwell's rifle had found its mark. Nathan reached Clara's side just as her legs gave out, catching her before she could fall. The revolver slipped from her nerveless fingers as the reality of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. She had killed a man, ended a human life, with 2 pulls of a trigger, and nothing would ever be the same. "You saved my life," Nathan said quietly, his arm supporting her weight. "Donovan had me dead to rights." Clara looked at the outlaw leader's body sprawled among the rocks and felt her stomach lurch. "I've never killed anyone before." "He was a murderer and a thief who showed no mercy to his victims," Nathan replied firmly. "What you did was justice, not murder. Tom's death has been avenged." The surviving gang members were quickly secured, with ropes from the stage, their weapons confiscated, and their wounds tended by Doc Mills. The silver shipment was intact, its cargo of precious metal worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. But Clara found herself thinking not of silver or justice, but of the weight of Thomas's gun in her hand and the look in Donovan's eyes as he died. The ride back to Copper Ridge was a triumph marred by the cost of victory. One of the Posse members had been seriously wounded, though Doc Mills was confident he would recover, and Clara struggled with emotions she couldn't name or understand. She had come west to be a bride and found herself a killer instead, and she wasn't sure which transformation was more profound. Nathan rode beside her in companionable silence, seeming to understand that she needed time to process what had happened. The desert that had seemed so hostile that morning now felt almost welcoming, as if her violent baptism had earned her a place in its harsh embrace. When Copper Ridge's buildings appeared on the horizon, Clara felt a complex mixture of relief and uncertainty. She had a home now and water, and the knowledge that Thomas's killers had paid for their crimes. But she also had the memory of taking a human life, and that burden would follow her for the rest of her days. The question that remained was what kind of life she would build from the ashes of her original dreams, and whether Nathan Cross would be part of that future or simply another chapter in her education about the realities of frontier justice. The return to Copper Ridge felt like emerging from a fever dream into harsh daylight. Word of the Posse's success had spread quickly through the small community, and a crowd gathered in the main street to welcome back their heroes. Clara found herself the center of unwanted attention as the story of her role in the gunfight spread from mouth to mouth, each telling adding embellishments that made her sound like some sort of frontier Amazon, rather than a terrified woman who had acted on pure instinct. Mrs. Foster embraced her tearfully on the steps of the inn, praising her courage, while Clara stood rigid with exhaustion and emotional numbness. The older woman's husband had remained safely in town, watching the jail as promised, and her relief was palpable as she fussed over Clara's dusty clothes and sunburned face. "You need a bath and rest," Mrs. Foster declared, ushering Clara toward the stairs. "And something to eat. You look ready to collapse." Clara allowed herself to be led upstairs, grateful for the older woman's motherly attention. The bath was a luxury she hadn't expected to appreciate so much. The hot water, washing away the dust and sweat of the desert, along with some of the lingering shock of violence. But as she soaked in the copper tub, images from the gunfight kept flashing through her mind with unwelcome clarity. She could still see Jake Donovan's face in that final moment, the surprise in his eyes as he realized death had found him. She could feel the weight of Thomas's revolver in her hand, the way it had bucked with each shot. Most disturbing of all, she could remember the cold satisfaction she had felt as the outlaw leader fell, an emotion that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. When she finally emerged from her room that evening, dressed in her best remaining gown and with her hair arranged as properly as circumstances allowed, she found Nathan Cross waiting in the inn's small parlor. He had cleaned up as well, trading his dusty trail clothes for a white shirt and dark trousers that emphasized his lean build. But his storm grey eyes held the same shadows that Clara felt in her own soul. "How are you feeling?" he asked, rising, as she entered the room. "Different," Clara replied honestly, "like I've crossed some sort of line that I can never uncross." Nathan nodded slowly. "Taking a life changes you, even when it's justified. The first time is always the hardest." "The first time." Clara studied his face carefully. "How many men have you killed?" "Enough to know that it never gets easy, no matter what some people claim. Each one leaves a mark, changes you in ways you don't expect." Nathan moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening street. "But the alternative is letting evil men do whatever they please to innocent people. Sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between bad and worse." Clara joined him at the window, watching the townspeople go about their evening routines with the comfortable confidence of people who knew they were safe. Children played in the dusty street while their parents tended to chores, and somewhere a woman was singing a lullaby in a voice sweet enough to carry on the desert air. "Thomas died trying to protect people like that," Clara said quietly. "Families who just want to live their lives without fear. He did, and because of what you did today, they can continue living those lives." Nathan turned to face her directly. "The territorial governor is putting a substantial reward on the Donovan gang, dead or alive. Your share will be enough to buy breeding, stock for the ranch, maybe even hire some help for the heavy work." Clara felt a flush of heat in her cheeks. "I don't want money for killing a man." "Then think of it as payment for protecting innocent lives," Nathan said gently, "or as compensation for the cattle they stole from Tom's ranch. Either way, it's yours by right, and refusing it won't bring Donovan back to life." The logic was sound, but Clara still felt uncomfortable with the idea of profiting from violence. She had been raised to believe that money earned through bloodshed was cursed, bringing misfortune to those who accepted it. But she was also practical enough to recognize that the reward money represented her best chance of making the ranch viable. "What happens now?" she asked, changing the subject. "To the surviving gang members, I mean. They'll be tried in Prescott, assuming they live long enough to reach the territorial capital. Frontier justice moves quickly when the evidence is clear." Nathan's expression hardened. "They'll hang, most likely. It's what they deserve after all the innocent people they've murdered." Clara shivered despite the warm evening air. The idea of men dying because of her actions, even indirectly, was difficult to accept. She understood the necessity of justice, but understanding and accepting were two different things entirely. "You're thinking too much," Nathan observed. "What happened today was necessary. Without your intervention, I'd be dead, and the gang would have escaped with enough silver to finance months of additional raids. How many more families would have suffered while we tried to track them down again?" "I know you're right," Clara said, "but knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your heart are different things." Nathan was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the lamplight. "Would it help if I told you that Tom would have been proud of what you did today? He was the kind of man who believed in standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous." Clara felt tears threaten for the first time since learning of Thomas's death. "I wish I could have known him better, really known him, not just the man in his letters." "He was exactly the man in his letters," Nathan replied. "Honest, kind, optimistic about the future, even when the present looked grim. He saw the best in everyone, sometimes when it wasn't there to see. He would have loved you deeply, Clara, and he would have spent his life trying to make you happy." The use of her first name sent an unexpected thrill through Clara's chest. During their brief acquaintance, Nathan had maintained proper formality, addressing her as Miss Whitman even in the most informal circumstances. The change suggested a shift in their relationship, a crossing of boundaries that had previously seemed fixed. "And what about you?" Clara asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "What do you see when you look at me?" Nathan's eyes darkened, and for a moment Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. "I see a woman who traveled halfway across the country to marry a stranger because she believed in the possibility of love. I see someone who faced the loss of everything she had planned for and chose to build something new instead of running away. I see courage and determination and a kind of strength that this territory desperately needs." Clara felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the hunger in his gaze, the careful restraint of a man who wanted something he wasn't sure he had the right to claim. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility, charged with the kind of tension that came from attraction acknowledged but not yet acted upon. "Nathan," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I should go," he said, stepping back from the window. "You've been through enough today without me complicating things further." "What if I want things to be complicated?" Clara asked, moving closer instead of letting him retreat. "What if simple isn't what I need right now?" Nathan went very still, his breath catching as she reached up to touch his cheek. The skin was rough with day-old stubble, warm beneath her palm, and she could feel the tension in his jaw as he fought his own desires. "Clara," he said, her name a warning and a plea combined. "I came west to marry one good man," she whispered. "He's dead, but perhaps there's another good man who might be interested in the position." Nathan's control finally cracked. His arms came around her waist, pulling her against his chest, as his mouth found hers in a kiss that was desperate and tender and full of all the words they hadn't yet spoken. Clara melted into his embrace, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with a passion that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "This isn't how I planned for this to happen," he said roughly. "Plans have a way of changing out here," Clara replied, echoing his own words from their first meeting. "Sometimes the unexpected turns out to be exactly what you need." "Are you sure about this?" Nathan asked, his hands gentle on her waist. "A week ago you were planning to marry my best friend. I don't want to be a replacement or a consolation prize." Clara considered the question seriously, searching her heart for the truth beneath the confusion of recent events. "Thomas and I were strangers who shared a dream of building something together. What I feel for you is different, deeper, based on who you really are rather than who I hoped someone might be." Nathan's smile was like sunrise after a long, dark night. "In that case, Miss Whitman, would you do me the honor of letting me court you properly? With flowers and dinner invitations and all the traditional nonsense that civilized people expect?" Clara laughed, the sound bright and genuine after days of grief and uncertainty. "I think I'd like that very much, Deputy Cross. Though you should know that I'm not entirely civilized anymore. Killing outlaws tends to change a woman's perspective on propriety." "I'm counting on it," Nathan replied, pulling her close for another kiss. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Clara began the process of transforming Thomas's ranch into a working homestead. The territorial reward money arrived as promised, along with a formal letter of commendation from the governor himself. Clara used the funds to purchase breeding stock from a cattle ranch in New Mexico, carefully selecting animals that could thrive in the harsh Arizona environment. Nathan proved to be an invaluable partner in the enterprise, his knowledge of local conditions and livestock complementing Clara's careful planning and attention to detail. He spent his evenings at the ranch after finishing his duties in town, helping to repair corrals and outbuildings that had suffered from neglect since Thomas's death. The work was hard and often frustrating, complicated by Clara's inexperience with ranch life and the constant challenges of frontier living. But there was something deeply satisfying about building something tangible from nothing, about seeing empty pastures gradually fill with cattle and watching the abandoned homestead come back to life. "You're a natural at this," Nathan observed one evening as they watched the sun set over their small herd. "Tom would be amazed at what you've accomplished in such a short time." Clara leaned against the corral fence, tired but content. "I had a good teacher," she replied, "and strong motivation. This land feels like home now, in a way that Philadelphia never did." "What was it like back east?" Nathan asked. "Your life, before you came here?" Clara was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Suffocating," she said finally. "Everything was decided for you before you were born. Who you could marry, how you could earn money, what you were allowed to think about. Women were expected to be decorative and obedient, nothing more. And now I can shoot outlaws and brand cattle and make my own decisions about my future." Clara smiled at the incongruity of it. "I'm not sure my aunt would approve, but I've never been happier." Nathan reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Speaking of your future, there's something I need to ask you." Clara felt her heart skip as she recognized the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" "The sheriff is retiring. Next month, the territorial government has offered me his position, which would mean a substantial increase in salary and responsibility. It would also mean that I could afford to support a family." Clara turned to face him fully, seeing the nervousness beneath his careful composure. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Nathan dropped to one knee in the dust beside the corral, pulling a small box from his pocket. "Clara Whitman, would you marry me? Not because you need protection or because it's convenient, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with you." The ring in the box was simple but elegant, a single diamond set in gold that caught the last rays of the setting sun. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that this proposal was everything Thomas's letters had promised but could never deliver. A declaration of love based on true knowledge and shared experience. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Nathan Cross, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, then stood to gather her into his arms. This time their kiss was full of promise rather than desperation, a sealing of vows spoken and unspoken. "When?" Clara asked when they finally separated. "As soon as possible," Nathan replied. "I've waited long enough to find someone like you. I don't want to waste any more time." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town, with most of Copper Ridge in attendance. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her new life, while Nathan stood straight and proud in his best suit. Sheriff Hartwell performed the ceremony in his capacity as a territorial magistrate, his weathered face creased with genuine pleasure as he pronounced them husband and wife. Mrs. Foster wept openly during the service, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, while her husband stood stoically beside her. Doc Mills played a wheezing organ that had seen better days, and Frank Russo provided a wedding cake that was only slightly lopsided. The entire celebration had the rough-edged warmth that characterized frontier communities, where genuine affection mattered more than social polish. After the ceremony, the newlyweds returned to the ranch that was now truly theirs, driving through the desert in a buckboard decorated with wildflowers and trailing tin cans. The small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the evening light, and smoke rose from the chimney of the house that Clara had made into a real home. "Any regrets?" Nathan asked as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking about the life she had left behind in Philadelphia and the one she had found in Arizona. "Just one," she said finally. Nathan's face showed his concern. "What's that?" "I regret that Thomas never got to see what his sacrifice made possible. He died protecting people he'd never met, and now those people are safe because of his courage. I wish he could know that his death wasn't meaningless." Nathan pulled her closer, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Maybe he does know. Maybe somewhere beyond this world, he's watching us build the life he dreamed of and smiling because it turned out even better than he hoped." Clara leaned into her husband's embrace, feeling the contentment that came from finding her true place in the world. She had come west as a mail-order bride seeking a new beginning, and she had found something far more precious than she had ever dared to hope for. Love earned through shared struggle, partnership forged in the crucible of danger, and a home built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek, carrying the promise of seasons to come and changes yet to be faced. But Clara was no longer afraid of change or challenge. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, capable of defending what she loved and building what she needed from whatever materials life provided. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow and learn, and build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful land. But tonight, sitting beside the man she loved in the place she had chosen to call home, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. 5 years passed, like seasons flowing into one another, each marked by the slow but steady transformation of the Cross Ranch from a modest homestead into a thriving operation. Clara stood on the expanded front porch of their house, watching her husband Nathan work with their prize bull in the main corral. The adobe structure had grown over the years, with additional rooms added as their family expanded and their prosperity increased. The cattle operation now boasted over 200 head of prime beef stock, their distinctive cross brand known throughout the territory for quality animals that could thrive in the harsh desert environment. Clara had proven to have an unexpected talent for breeding decisions, her careful record-keeping and attention to bloodlines producing calves that brought top prices at the territorial cattle auctions. But it wasn't just the ranch that had grown. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly, where their second child grew steadily toward an autumn birth. Their first, Thomas Nathan Cross, named for the man whose sacrifice had made their happiness possible, played in the dusty yard with a wooden horse that his father had carved during the long winter evenings. At 3 years old, little Tommy showed signs of inheriting both his mother's determination and his father's steady temperament. He had Nathan's storm-grey eyes and Clara's dark hair, and already demonstrated the kind of fearless curiosity that was essential for survival in frontier country. Clara watched him attempt to rope one of the barn cats and smiled at his serious concentration. "Mama, watch me," Tommy called, swinging his miniature lasso with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "I'm watching, sweetheart," Clara replied, settling into the rocking chair that Nathan had built for her during her first pregnancy. The chair had become her favorite spot for watching the daily rhythm of ranch life unfold before her. Nathan finished his work with the bull and walked toward the house, his gait still confident despite the limp he carried from a riding accident 2 years earlier. The injury had ended his career as a peace officer, but it had also freed him to focus entirely on building their ranch into something substantial. His replacement as sheriff, a competent young man from Texas, had proven capable of maintaining the peace that Nathan's reputation had established. "How are you feeling today?" Nathan asked, climbing the porch steps and leaning down to kiss Clara's forehead. It was a ritual they had developed during her pregnancies, his way of checking on both his wife and their unborn child without making a fuss about it. "Tired but content," Clara replied honestly. "This baby seems more active than Tommy was. I think we might have another little cowboy on our hands." "Or cowgirl," Nathan said with a grin. "Don't forget who shot Jake Donovan when the chips were down." Clara laughed, though the memory of that day had softened over time into something more like a story told about someone else. The young woman who had ridden desperately across the desert to prevent an ambush seemed like a different person now. Someone brave and reckless who had existed before marriage and motherhood had taught her the value of caution. "Speaking of which," Nathan continued, settling into the chair beside hers, "I got some interesting news in town today. The territorial government is talking about statehood again. They think Arizona might be admitted to the Union within the next few years." Clara considered this development with mixed emotions. Statehood would bring progress and development to their isolated territory, but it would also bring more people, more laws, and more complications to the relatively simple life they had built. Change was inevitable, she had learned, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. "What would that mean for us?" she asked. "More markets for our cattle, better transportation, schools for the children," Nathan listed, "but also more competition, higher taxes, and probably more government interference in how we run our operation." Tommy abandoned his attempts at roping the cat and ran toward them, his small face flushed with excitement. "Papa, can you show me how to throw the rope like you do?" Nathan scooped up his son and settled him on his lap. "First, you have to learn to handle a regular rope before you try for anything fancy. And you have to remember that we only rope cattle and horses, not cats or chickens or your mama." "What about outlaws?" Tommy asked with the bloodthirsty interest of a small boy. Nathan and Clara exchanged a look over their son's head. The story of how they had met had become family legend, but they had been careful to emphasize the justice and protection aspects rather than the violence. Tommy knew that his parents had helped catch bad men who were hurting innocent people, but the details of that confrontation remained appropriately vague. "Outlaws are for lawmen to handle," Nathan said diplomatically. "Our job is to raise cattle and take care of our family." Tommy seemed satisfied with this answer and wriggled down from his father's lap to resume his play. Clara watched him with the mixture of pride and worry that seemed to be the natural state of motherhood. The frontier was safer now than it had been when she first arrived, but it was still a place where children learned early to be responsible for their own safety. "Mrs. Foster sent word that she's planning a harvest celebration next month," Clara said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. "She wants to know if we'll contribute some beef for the community dinner." "Of course," Nathan replied. "We'll butcher one of the older steers. It'll be good to see everyone again." The harvest celebration had become an annual tradition in Copper Ridge, a chance for the scattered ranch families to come together and celebrate another year of survival and prosperity. Clara looked forward to these gatherings, which provided a welcome break from the isolation of ranch life and a chance to catch up with friends who lived too far away for casual visiting. As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself thinking about the changes that 5 years had brought to their small community. Several new families had established ranches in the area, drawn by reports of good water and fertile grazing land. The town itself had grown substantially with new businesses and even talk of establishing a proper school rather than relying on itinerant teachers. Dr. Mills had taken on a partner, a young physician fresh from medical school in Chicago who brought new techniques and modern equipment to their frontier practice. Mrs. Foster's Inn had expanded to accommodate the increasing number of travelers passing through on their way to the mining camps in the mountains. Even the Silver Dollar Saloon had acquired a veneer of respectability, with Frank Russo installing actual tables and chairs instead of the rough planks and barrels that had served when Clara first arrived. Progress was coming to Arizona territory, whether they wanted it or not, and Clara found herself torn between nostalgia for the simpler times and excitement about the opportunities that development might bring. That evening, after Tommy had been tucked into his bed with a story about cowboys and cattle drives, Clara and Nathan sat on their porch, enjoying the cool desert air. The autumn nights were beginning to carry a hint of the winter to come, and Clara pulled a shawl around her shoulders as they watched the stars emerge in the vast sky above. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Clara asked, her hand resting on her growing belly. "If the Donovan gang hadn't killed Thomas, if I had married him as planned?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "Tom was a good man, and he would have made you happy. But I can't bring myself to regret the way things turned out, even though it came at such a terrible price." Clara nodded, understanding the complexity of his feelings. Their happiness was built on the foundation of tragedy, and while they had found genuine love and contentment together, it had come through circumstances that neither would have chosen. "I used to feel guilty about being happy," Clara confessed, "as if enjoying my life with you was somehow betraying Thomas's memory. And now I think that living well is the best way to honor his sacrifice. He died trying to protect innocent people, and those people have gone on to build families and communities and good lives. That's what justice really looks like, isn't it? Not just punishment for the guilty, but the chance for the innocent to flourish." Nathan reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining in the familiar gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Tom would approve of what we've built here. He always said this territory needed people who were willing to plant roots and make something permanent." A cry from inside the house interrupted their conversation, and Clara rose carefully to tend to Tommy, who had awakened from a bad dream. She found their son sitting up in his small bed, rubbing his eyes and calling for his mama in the sleepy voice of a confused child. "It's all right, sweetheart," Clara murmured, settling beside him and pulling him into her arms. "Mama's here. You're safe." Tommy snuggled against her, his small body warm and solid in her embrace. "I dreamed about bad men coming to take our cows," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "There are no bad men coming," Clara assured him, smoothing his hair. "Papa and I will always protect you and our home." As she rocked her son back to sleep, Clara reflected on the simple truth of that promise. She and Nathan had proven capable of defending what they loved, and they would continue to do so for as long as they drew breath. The frontier might be changing, becoming more civilized and complex, but the fundamental need to protect family and home remained constant. The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of a small wagon train passing through on their way to California. The emigrants were a mix of families and single men seeking opportunity in the gold fields, their possessions packed into covered wagons that had seen hard use on the long journey west. Nathan and Clara offered hospitality, as was customary on the frontier, providing fresh water for the travelers and allowing them to rest their animals in the shade of the cottonwoods by the creek. In return, the emigrants shared news from back east and offered trade goods that were difficult to obtain in their isolated location. One of the families included a young woman about Clara's age who was traveling with her husband and two small children. She introduced herself as Mary Patterson and explained that they were seeking a new start after her husband's business had failed in Ohio. "I was so frightened when we started this journey," Mary confessed, as she helped Clara prepare dinner for the travelers. "The stories you hear about hostile Indians and outlaws and wild animals. But everyone we've met has been so kind and helpful." Clara smiled, remembering her own fears when she had first arrived in Arizona territory. "The frontier has its dangers, but it also has good people who understand the value of helping each other. You'll find your place in California, just as I found mine here." "How did you adapt to this life?" Mary asked, watching Clara move efficiently around her kitchen. "Everything seems so different from what I'm used to back east." "You learn what you need to learn," Clara replied simply, "and you discover that you're stronger than you thought you were. The important thing is to embrace the change instead of fighting it." That evening, the emigrants shared their campfire with the Cross family, trading stories and songs under the vast desert sky. Tommy listened wide-eyed to tales of buffalo, herds and prairie storms, while Clara found herself offering advice to the women about everything from treating saddle sores to preserving food in hot weather. Nathan and the men discussed routes and water sources, sharing the kind of practical information that could mean the difference between life and death on the trail. Clara watched her husband's easy authority with strangers and felt a familiar surge of pride in the man she had married. When the emigrants departed the next morning, resuming their westward journey toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Clara stood watching their wagons disappear into the distance with mixed emotions. Part of her envied their adventure and the possibilities that lay ahead of them, while another part felt grateful for the stability and security she had found. "Do you ever miss it?" Nathan asked, joining her at the fence. "The excitement of not knowing what comes next?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I miss the sense that anything was possible," she said finally. "But I wouldn't trade what we have for all the adventure in the world." As if to emphasize her point, the baby kicked vigorously, making Clara gasp and place both hands on her belly. Nathan immediately moved to support her, his face creased with concern. "Just active," Clara assured him. "This one is definitely going to be a handful." "Like his mother," Nathan said with a grin, earning himself a playful swat on the arm. The months that followed brought the usual challenges of ranch life, complicated by Clara's advancing pregnancy and the approach of winter. Nathan hired additional help for the heavy work, a young Mexican man named Carlos, whose family had worked cattle in Sonora for generations. Carlos proved to be skilled with horses and cattle, and his wife Maria became invaluable in helping Clara manage the household duties that grew more difficult as her pregnancy progressed. When their daughter was finally born on a cold December morning, she entered the world with a lusty cry that announced her determination to be heard. They named her Rose after Clara's mother, and she proved to have her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. "She's perfect," Nathan whispered, holding his daughter for the first time while Clara rested in their bed. "Absolutely perfect." Clara smiled at the wonder in her husband's voice. Despite his experience with Tommy, Nathan still seemed amazed by the miracle of new life, treating each of his children as if they were the most precious things on earth. "She's going to be trouble," Clara predicted, watching Rose's tiny fists wave in apparent indignation at finding herself outside the warm cocoon of the womb. "I can tell already." Winter settled over the ranch with unusual severity that year, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold that tested both human endurance and animal survival. Nathan and Carlos worked tirelessly to keep the cattle fed and watered, breaking ice on the creek daily and hauling hay to the pastures where the animals huddled against the wind. Clara spent the long winter evenings nursing Rose and teaching Tommy his letters by lamplight, while Nathan carved wooden toys and repaired tack by the fire. The isolation that winter brought was offset by the deep contentment of family life. The sense of building something lasting that would endure long after they were gone. When spring finally arrived, it brought not just warmth and green grass, but also news that would change their lives forever. A letter from the territorial capital announced that Arizona had indeed been accepted for statehood, with the formal ceremony planned for the following year. "It's the end of an era," Nathan observed, reading the letter aloud to Clara as they sat on their porch watching Tommy and Rose play in the yard. At 18 months, Rose was already showing signs of the fearless independence that seemed to be a family trait. The beginning of a new one, Clara corrected. Our children will grow up as citizens of a state, not a territory. They'll have opportunities we never dreamed of. Nathan folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Are you ready for that? For our little corner of the world to become part of something bigger? Clara looked out at the landscape that had become home, at the cattle, grazing peacefully in the distance, and the solid house they had built together. Change was coming whether they were ready or not, but she had learned that adaptation was the key to survival in any environment. I'm ready, she said firmly. We've built something strong here, something that can weather whatever changes come, and we'll teach our children to be ready too. As the sun set over the red rock formations that had witnessed their transformation, from strangers to lovers, to partners in life's great adventure, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing she had found her true place in the world. She had come west as a mail-order bride, seeking a new beginning, and she had discovered something far more precious than she had ever dared to hope for. The future stretched ahead of them full of unknowns, but Clara no longer feared uncertainty. She had learned that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, that courage could be found in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the best things in life came through the worst circumstances. The desert wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come and adventures still to be lived. But for now, sitting beside the man she loved with their children playing safely nearby, Clara was content to simply enjoy the moment and the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.